Again, my name's Blair Allen, the Manager of Transit Development for Grand River Transit. So joining me are our project consultants with Dillon Consulting, who will be presenting today. I will pass it off to their team so they can introduce themselves. Then Dillon will go over our agenda and carry on with the presentation. Jacob, over to you.
Good evening and welcome to everyone joining us. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. As Blair mentioned, my name is Jacob Terry and I am a transit planner with Dillon Consulting. With us as well as Dennis Carr, a partner and transit planning lead with Dillon, who is the consulting project manager for the township transit strategy. Let's get into the agenda for this evening. Following the introductions, we will have a presentation from Dennis on the project overview and design of township transit services. And then we will have some polling and questions to you in our audience on your thoughts on how transit service could evolve in Woolwich. Dennis will then share the overview of the service delivery options and we'll have a discussion on those. We will then share a bit more on the next steps for the project and have time for questions towards the end of the session. We understand that there may be different perspectives on the desire for transit in Woolwich, and we encourage you to share your input in a respectful way so we can have a meaningful discussion tonight. I will now hand it over to Dennis to get started on the presentation.
Okay, thanks very much, Jacob. Appreciate the introduction. So once again, my name is Dennis Carr. I'm a partner at Dillon and also the transit planning lead and project manager on the consulting side for this assignment. So I really appreciate you joining us here today. I'm going to start with a bit of a project overview and the overall vision of the assignment and what we're trying to achieve and some of the key steps that we're going to take. So if you turn over the next slide, Jacob. So every project starts with a vision. So our vision is to expand and enhance existing township transit service to effectively and efficiently meet the mobility needs of Waterloo Region's township residents. So that's what we're trying to do in this study, and we're looking at all 4 townships within the region, and today's focus is on Woolwich. In order to achieve that vision, we've identified a number of key project goals. The first is to establish where the highest demand for public transit service exists. So we know there's currently transit service within the township. What is that current demand? Is that demand growing? Is there demand for service elsewhere within the township that we need to start thinking about? These are some of the things that we're collecting through data collection, as well as through a community survey that's out right now, as well as conversations with stakeholders and members of the public, including at tonight's session. Our second goal is to understand the potential benefits of transit service. So if we are to improve, enhance, or expand transit service, why are we doing that? What are the benefits of it? What is the need for township residents and employees and students that it actually services? The third is taking that information in terms of the overall benefit, the overall demand, designing a transit service for each township. So what does that look like? Do we maintain what we have today? Do we expand it? Do we enhance it? What is that plan for Woolwich and for each of the townships? And then finally, when we understand that plan, we develop an implementation plan on how we move forward. So those are the project goals, and we're working with the GRT staff to help understand that. Next slide. In terms of timeline, we've started this project a number of months ago, and we've already conducted a preliminary review of sort of existing services, existing travel demand, and we've used that information to develop some preliminary concept designs, which we'll present to you today. Today is our first round of engagement. As Blair had mentioned, this is our 4th and final session with each of the townships. We've also have a community survey out right now, which we encourage all of you to fill out because it provides really important information about your thoughts on transit, the values that you have, and what potential service design options could look like. From this session and from the other engagement activities around one, we'll take that feedback and that input and refine sort of the options that we have and develop a preferred service strategy and plan. We'll then go to a second round of engagement to present that recommended draft strategy, get additional feedback, and then taking that feedback, finalize the design, and present recommendations to regional council. So that's the timeline, and those are the steps that we're undertaking. So let's talk about transit and what transit looks like in townships. And when I start these presentations, I always like to start with a sort of a basic understanding about what is the value, what is the need for transit. Next slide, Jacob. So there's many benefits that transit services can provide, and I know most of you have answered that you've not taken transit in the past year, but transit does exist within the township. And whether you use it or not, or whether your neighbors or family members use it, there is a lot of value that transit can provide to members of your community. First and foremost, it can help address housing affordability concerns with rising cost of living. So once again, it's that having access to some level of service can allow you to make the decision to move from a 3-car household to a 2-car, from a 2-car to a 1-car, or a 1-car to a no-car household. And as we know, vehicles are a considerable expense. So even if you use transit once a month, every day, twice a year, having that option available to you can limit that overall expense of owning and operating a private automobile and having that extra expense to address affordable housing concerns. It provides access to hospitals, to medical appointments, to employment, to training, to education. And as we age, it provides more mobility options where we may not have the ability to drive anymore, or for parents with young children who don't have their driver's license, providing the ability to become more independent for after-school activities or jobs. It provides options to participate in recreational activities and points of interest within the township. So providing that ability to access for both visitors that come into the township and spend dollars within the township and residents as well. It addresses greater concerns over sustainability and protecting the natural environment. Once again, by reducing single occupant vehicle travel and getting more people into increasing the number of people in a vehicle can reduce emissions. It accommodates increase in people who are choosing not to own an automobile. More and more, there are people that are delaying getting their driver's license or owning an automobile, so it provides that mobility option. And for travel into areas where there's increased traffic congestion, it provides that ability to help address some of that congestion by reducing the number of vehicles on the road. But we do recognize there are challenges in implementing services within townships. These are typically large rural areas with low population density. And when you think about transit traditionally, transit thrives on density. When we can get more people close to a stop, it increases the number of people and increases the effectiveness of that service. We have limited pedestrian infrastructure to be able to access stops. So when you go outside of the more urbanized areas such as Breslau and into the more rural parts of the township, that ability to access stops is more difficult. And we have many services and amenities that are located outside of the township, so it's difficult to find the appropriate route structure to accommodate everybody's needs. What I will say is, when you think about transit within the township or within any township, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. There are different service models that are available that help adapt to the environment in which we're operating. So we're not trying to take a big city solution and put it within a township. We're trying to find a solution that works better within townships to adapt to the land use and density and rural nature of many parts of that township. So we can help address those challenges. As I mentioned before, we do have transit that's already in place within the township. 2 services that exist that are operated by Grand River Transit. We have that fixed route service that operates into Elmira and through St. Jacobs. So that's more of that inter-community route. And we also have an on-demand service within Breslau that connects individuals within the Breslau community and to fixed route options elsewhere within the region. So I'll talk a little bit about how these two route structures differ in the next slide. So as we're planning transit service options for the townships, we're going to look at a couple of different things. The first consideration that we have is, what are the service area options that we want to consider? So the first type of option that we can look at is what's called a township-wide service. And this is a service that's available to any resident within the township. It doesn't matter where you live. It will connect you to any point in the township to any other point in the township. The second type of service that we explored was what's called more of a local circulator. So this will be an example of if you had a transit service within Elmira that operated strictly within the urbanized area of Elmira. So it's a lot shorter of a route. It's connecting to different destinations within an urban area. And then the third type of service would be an urban connector. And this is where we would connect a couple of the more urbanized areas to a major municipality or a much larger urban municipality. And the example of that is Route 21 and Route 77. Next slide. We also explored different service types or service models: fixed route, on demand, and flex route. And I'll go through each of these in a little bit more detail. Fixed route, if you go to the next slide, Jacob, is what you see as that traditional bus service. And this is where a vehicle operates on a fixed route and a fixed schedule and doesn't deviate from that route or schedule. It's pre-planned. So as a customer, you need to locate a transit stop, walk or roll to that stop, and that vehicle will take you to your destination or transfer point where you can complete your trip and walk or roll to your final destination. So these type of services are best suited in areas where there's consistent demand and travel patterns, and there is some level of density, whether that's entirely within an urban area or connecting different urban areas together. And they're not typically well suited where there's very low density or the population is very dispersed. So once again, Route 21 that starts in Elmira and ends up at Conestoga College is an example of a fixed route. The next service model that we were looking at is what's called on-demand transit. Now, this is a shared ride service, but there's no fixed route or schedule. Instead, the service operates within a predefined area, and passengers who want to use this service must either call a customer service agent or use their mobile phone to request a ride. And they can typically do this the day that they want to travel. So what would happen is a customer would identify their starting point, where they want to go, and approximately what time they want to travel. And the mobile app will identify when a vehicle could arrive at their stop and when they would be dropped off. If they selected that ride, they would then proceed to the pickup point. This ride would be a shared ride. So you might pick up a friend or a neighbor along the way, drop off somebody else along the way before it drops you off. But the point is the route is dynamic. So it always look for, depending on who's on the vehicle, the shortest possible path, and will not always follow the same path to get to your destination. So these type of services work best when there's lower demand and can be well suited also for larger rural areas. So the service that's currently in place in Breslau is an example of an on-demand service. Next slide. And this is just a visual of what I just described, where you would book your trip using your smartphone, or you would book it calling in, request the ride, you would walk or roll to the pickup point where that vehicle would pick you up and take you to your destination, or take you to a transfer point where you complete your trip on another GRT vehicle. So just an illustration of how that works. Finally, we have a flex route service. And a good example of the flex route is a service that's currently in place in Woolwich Township that connects residents of New Hamburg and Baden to the Boardwalk Terminal in Waterloo. So this is a combination of a fixed route and an on-demand service, where the majority of the route operates as a fixed route, but that vehicle can deviate off the fixed route to get a little closer to where a passenger wants to get picked up or dropped off, but only does it in areas where there's not a consistent number of passengers requesting that ride. So if that vehicle goes by on a route 10 times during the day, but in this flex portion of the route, we may only have a passenger trip request 3 or 4 times in the day. It may not make sense for that fixed route to go into that neighborhood every single time. So in this scenario, the passenger, when boarding the bus or ahead of time, would request the driver to flex off the route. And if the driver can accommodate that request, they will flex off in that predefined area. So those are the 3 different route types. We also have different vehicle types that we can use to operate this service. So what you would typically see in a fixed or a flex route is a standard 40-foot vehicle that has a larger capacity to accommodate more individuals. And we would use this if there's a higher passenger demand. We can also use a smaller, what's called a cutaway vehicle, which may have a capacity or be able to accommodate about 12 to 15 passengers. All of these vehicles are accessible. The cutaway vehicle is a smaller vehicle and it's a bit shorter. For on-demand, what we typically see is either that cutaway vehicle that I just described, that sort of 15-passenger vehicle, or an accessible converted van vehicle, which is a little bit smaller. And the choice of that vehicle really depends on what we feel the demand for that service is. And we're using the most appropriate vehicle to accommodate that. Next slide. Finally, when we're thinking about planning for transit service, it's all about trade-offs and choices. And I always like to say, if you have a resource, we have to make a decision on what's the most effective use of that resource. So let's say that resource is a vehicle or a driver. So we may decide, if we have that one resource, we want to focus in on settlement areas. So we may want to focus in on just, let's provide service within Elmira, let's provide service within Breslau or within St. Jacobs. And that's it. And we may, because we're focusing on that area, we may be able to provide more service. Or we may decide it's more important to extend that service out into the more rural parts of the township. But if we still have that same resource, then that means we're spreading that resource out a little bit further, which may mean, although we have a bigger geographic spread, the level of service may be less. So these are all trade-offs that we have to make, and there's more. We may also look at a couple of other trade-offs, which include, next slide, Jacob. Focusing on travel within the township only or local, or focusing on travel that goes to intercommunity. We will also look at extending hours of service, so taking that same resource and operating in the weekends and later in the evenings, or focusing on the core periods where the demand is highest and providing a higher frequency. And finally, we may focus on keeping fares very low, but maintaining a standard level of service, or increasing fares and providing more service. So these are all trade-offs and decisions we have to make. And to do that, we need to understand your values and what's important to you. What we'd like to do now is get your thoughts on some service options that we had identified for Woolwich. And we've divided up into different areas. So we'll start first with what the service looked like in Elmira. We'll then move on to Breslau, and then we'll move on to the more sort of rural areas. And again, we want to get your opinions and thoughts on this. So I'll first explain what the 2 options are. We'll open it up for any discussion if you require any clarification to how we presented these options, and then we'll do another poll. Then we'll move on to the next service area and the next service area after that. And the focus right now is to look at these options. We will have a lot of time set aside at the very end for any general questions that you may have on transit and any general comments and feedback. But we're hoping to sort of focus in on these subjects first. So what are some options for Elmira? The first option is to operate for GRT, to operate a fixed route within Elmira. So here is just sort of a sample of what something could look like in terms of a fixed route that would connect to Route 21. And that route would operate potentially in a one-way loop or two-way loop, depending on what the service could look like. And as I mentioned before, we would have that opportunity to walk or roll to the stop to connect to that route, and then to travel either within Elmira or connect to Route 21. The second option is to look at the potential for an on-demand zone within Elmira. So within this option, you would be able to travel anywhere within Elmira, within that zone, using on-demand service. So you'd be required to either use your smartphone or call in. A vehicle would pick you up at either a virtual stop near your home and take you to a destination within Elmira, or take you to a transfer point along Route 21 where you can transfer and complete your trip along the GRT network into the urban area of the region. So those are the two options that we were looking at and we wanted to get your thoughts on. Before Jacob opens up the poll, maybe I'll ask if anybody has any questions of clarification for these two options that they want to type in on the chat, on the Q&A.
One question, Dennis. Eric asks, how does the Elmira fixed route compare to the current Kiwanis route?
Okay. Blair, maybe I'll turn that one over to you to respond to.
Without pulling up the current route specifically, it is roughly the same routing option, which was an option we designed several years ago. And basically we would try and fit as much of the community as we can within that circulator route and how far we can go with in a reasonable length of time.
One of the benefits of that is that full integration with the rest of the GRT network. And that would be the same for both options that we're considering.
I'll give a few. We got another question. I figured that might occur. Nathan asked, approximately how long would the green route take in option 1? That might be a Blair question as well. You might be more familiar with that length.
Without taking again, I believe the current route is about a half-hour round trip time. And this would be similar to that type of thing. I don't have some of my staff who aren't available tonight, were the ones who had done some more of the work on that. And in reply to the other question that I see here is, how is it different? The fixed route option is basically, it is similar to what is out there now. There is not a necessarily major difference. It becomes just like we've been discussing in the past, is how we operate it and how it's integrated to the rest of the GRT network. The bigger difference would be the on-demand, where you would potentially allow not having a fixed schedule or a fixed routing on it, would allow it to expand and serve more of the community and get closer to some of the other areas that currently don't have it, particularly the sort of that southwest corner, which is fairly new growth.
Thank you, Blair, and thank you all for the questions. I don't see any more, so I'm going to open up the first poll here. Of the service options shown on the screen, which would you prefer? A Elmira fixed route, an Elmira on-demand zone? You like both options, you don't like either, or you don't live in or travel to Elmira?
I do see a question here about what would you expect the average wait for an on-demand service would be. Typically we would ask customers to book their ride or request that ride at least an hour in advance, and it would identify sort of the most appropriate or when that next vehicle would arrive. Could be sooner, could be later, really all depends on demand. So the more notice that you give, the more reliable the service would be for you.
And It says, you know, the wait time right now, the Breslau service does vary anywhere from 8 to 15 minutes right now, the wait time that's in the system. And I don't, forgive me, I don't know the exact measure of definition of that, but that in the data that comes out of our system, that's what it typically shows. And I would imagine this would be much different. If anything, this is probably a slightly more condensed area than the Breslau service.
While I have the poll still open, Mayor Chance has a question as well. The connector route is currently connected to Route 21. Are you suggesting this option would now be an on-demand, and could it be provided economically? Either Dennis
Yes,
or Blair.
what that would be the on-demand, by going to an on-demand route. The idea is that we could get closer to some of the areas that aren't as well served right now within the community, because on demand, by only going based on request to an area, you can stretch sort of the area that you cover, which is where we got the flex route from in the Wilmot service. And the same with this, we would be looking at that to get more area covered. The cost would be, basically you would run it on the same cost that you would run a vehicle now, or any, whatever contractor it is, whatever cost for the service would be. If you, it's based on the hours of service that you provide. If you got one vehicle, whatever the cost of that vehicle per hour is what the cost would be.
Thank you, Blair, and thank you for your questions. I'm going to close the poll now. Most of you do not live in or travel to Elmira, or you like both options, so it's helpful to know. Oh, I'll share the results so you can see those. There you go. All right, we'll move on to the next option, so I'll pass this back to Dennis.
Sure. Yeah, no, this was a good discussion about what that on-demand could look like versus a fixed route. And, you know, the only thing I'll say is, you know, one of the other benefits of on-demand is because it's not a predefined route, it has the potential to get you a little bit more directly to your destination. But versus a fixed route where it always takes the same amount of time and may take a little bit longer. The only difference is the consistency of a fixed route, and I always know I have to walk to the stop at this time to get my route, and I'll arrive at that time, where it may involve a little bit more pre-planning for an on-demand route. But as Blair had said, 8 to 15 minutes is sort of that average wait time that people are experiencing at Breslau. Speaking of Breslau is the second option.
Sorry, Dennis, just before we get there, I see another question that's come up about, well, both options have the exact same start and finish time, with the on-demand allow for extended coverage works. The style of route and sort of the structure of it doesn't really define the hours of service that we would have. So part of the question is with any service that we would provide, is what is the reasonable hours of service and the coverage that we would have. So if there's a need for shift work hours and say an 11 p.m. Shift change or something like that to provide service to, that's an option that can be done. And it basically comes down to, if we've got X amount of hours of service that we can provide for within the budget that we would have to do anything, then we can provide that. But it's the trade-offs that you have. So you might have, okay, if we provide a late night service for a shift, you may not be able to provide a midday service if you don't have as much fun, if you're based on the same amount of funds. So part of that is, and this is what we're looking for from people, is what are the hours of service that they would like to be provided. And once we have that, that can be part of our analysis and say, okay, if we want to run this spread of service from like 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., it's going to cost you this. if you want to then extend it to 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. or something like that, it's going to cost you this X amount of additional hours or dollars to do that.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Blair. Okay, so in the Breslau community, we currently have an on-demand service that's in place. And what is some of the options that we're looking for is the potential to introduce a fixed route service that may connect to different parts of the region. And so with this, there are several different routing options that we can look at if we go down this route. And what we're trying to get a better sense of is if you live or work or travel to Breslau, what are the key destinations outside of Breslau that you're looking to connect to? Could be the airport, it could be local destinations in Breslau, it could be Central Station, it could be East Victoria Street or elsewhere in Kitchener, it could be the Sports World Station or Cambridge Business Park or elsewhere in Cambridge. So that's what we want to sort of get your understanding of here is what's your preference? You know, maintaining that on-demand service, or if we were to introduce a fixed route service, what are the key destinations that we need to connect to? So I'll turn it back over to Jacob, who will conduct another poll. Before I do that, any questions in the Q&A about anything I've just explained to you about the options? Now we want to address what does transit service look like in more of the rural parts of the township. And so, as I mentioned to you before, one of the options that we're considering is, once again, that use of that on-demand service. And on-demand is probably the most effective of those service models when you get into the rural areas where there's no primary concentration of residents or employees or, you know, a major destination. And so what we looked at was the potential identification of 3 on-demand zones within Woolwich. The first one would potentially be combined with an on-demand zone in Wellesley or Northwest Wellesley. And within that zone, you'll be able to travel anywhere within the zone and with potential connections to fixed route services within St. Clement's, Elmira, or St. Jacobs. The second area that we considered was an on-demand zone within East Woolwich. And here we would introduce that on-demand zone connecting to Breslau and Bridgepoint. So again, travel anywhere within that zone with a connecting point into Breslau or Bridgepoint to connect to a fixed route service that could take you elsewhere within the region. And then finally, the potential for an on-demand zone in North Woolwich, where we would introduce that option to connect anywhere within that zone with connections to fixed route services within St. Jacobs and Elmira as part of Route 20. So those are the different options that we're considering and how we're looking to address the potential to provide that mobility and accessibility options within more of the rural parts of the township. So before I turn it over to Jacob for the final poll, are there any sort of questions about these concepts and how they would work for members that are participating today? And once again, just throw a question in the Q&A. Next slide, please, Jacob. Okay, so we'll now talk about some next steps and where we're going, and then we're going to open it up to sort of just general questions that you may have about the strategy and where we're at today. So I did talk earlier about the schedule and what these next steps are, and here I'm just providing some timelines to it. So we're right now in that first round of engagement, which is occurring in the early summer. Once we receive that feedback, and we do have that community survey that's open, that will close on August 2nd. We'll analyze the results, we'll analyze what we hear today and through each of the other township strategies and through our other discussions. We'll refine, we'll come back in the early fall for the second round of engagement. And we'd love to hear more about, you know, through the question and answer period, you know, how do we inform members of the public about that second round? You know, are the tools that we've used so far been effective? And then in the late fall is when we present the final recommended service design to regional council. So that's a bit of the timeline and what you can expect and where we're at today. So I will now open it up to some discussion. Do you have any thoughts about transit within Woolwich, about the existing service that's in place, about what we have planned or identified? And there's two ways to respond. We can, once again, use the Q&A tool if you prefer to type out your questions, or you can raise your hand and Jacob will unmute you.
We got one question. Are the users being told about the survey and engagement with signage on the buses? Might be a question for Blair, I believe.
Yeah, we're engaging them through various ways. There's signage up in various places. There is communication through our social media platforms. We are going to be out. We are going to have people out riding on various routes in the next few weeks to talk to people or get feedback in different ways from that. As well, there are pop-up sessions that we are doing for engagement for, as I think was noted, we've got 3 business plan processes going on right now. One for the general conventional service, one for the township service, and then one for Mobility Plus Kiwanis transit services. And those pop-ups are going to be getting sort of feedback or at least communications to people about all 3 of those plans, because they're all, even though we got 3 things going on, they're very related and we look at it as one unified process.
I think you've answered the second one already, which is, are you engaging directly with the current ridership? You just answered that one, so that's great. Then another question, given there is significant use of transit from the horse and buggy community, has there been any feedback solicited from them?
I'm not aware of directly. I have to check with our marketing comms people on that, but we know that it is a area that's often, as you know, that can be a challenge to get to the right people with that. I believe Dylan has looked at some processes as well on how best to reach out to some of them, and Woolwich is, and possibly Wellesley are more so the northern side of the urban areas where more of that community tends to live. And anything we can get back from that, as well as if there are avenues that you know of that can help us connect, feel free to let us know.
Question. Thank you for the questions so far as well. Next question is, for future engagement, could you install temporary signs at bus stops with a QR code linking to the survey?
I will check with their marketing staff to see what they are doing in terms of that and what the easiest way is to do for that type of thing, because we'd have to be a bit judicious in that and look at some of the key points if we're doing that, because we have 2,700 bus stops in the system. So we'd want to do that to a sort of limited number. And along the Woolwich route, we could look at some of those busy stops in St. Jacobs. The one up near the town hall in Woolwich is a fairly busy stop, as well as a couple along by towards where the grocery stores are. I know those ones are fairly busy as well.
But we really do appreciate this feedback, like anything that we can do to help make sure that people are aware of this study and that we are getting sort of that feedback in place. So again, if you have any other ideas about which community newspapers we need to advertise in, what are the best points or places or times that to engage individuals and make them aware. This public open house is being recorded and will be available on the region's website. The community survey is still in place for a couple of weeks, so we still have time to continue to collect that feedback, and we can also use that for the second round of engagement. So if there's any opportunities that weren't able to get to for this round. And those are good ideas that we can implement for the second round. We'll certainly look at those as well.
A couple of questions just came in. First, have you considered the high schools for feedback?
Yes, obviously those are areas that we would, and there are some stuff, obviously at this point, because we are just the timing of all these, I would think in our second rounds in the fall that we would reach out through that avenue more effectively.
Great. And then the next question, has there been communication with the larger employers, Conestoga Meats, Toyota, Home Hardware, hotels, Martins, especially those who have shift work within Woolwich?
We have had discussions with Toyota specifically because of some of the route change that we're doing down there right now. Now that's the main plant, which is in Cambridge, rather than, I know there's the other ones up in Elmira. How they communicate, I'm not sure. And Conestoga Meats, not specifically with this, although we have had numerous discussions with them in the past related to the Route 79. And again, I will look, one of my staff who's a more project manager for this, I will consult with him on what we've done for some of the employers that we've got out there.
Thank you. Any other questions? You're welcome to either raise your hand or submit more into the Q&A chat box. We have another slide after this, so if there are any more come in, we'll make some time to answer them. Otherwise, I'll pass it back to Blair and Dennis.
So, yes, thank you for you coming out tonight and engaging with us. We value it. This is one of a number of sessions we're having through our various plans, and we look forward to hearing any feedback that you or any people that you know of that you pass on the information to that can go through our Engage Waterloo platform would be greatly appreciated. So we are grateful for your interest in the township transit strategy. So if you haven't filled out the survey, please fill it out or again, pass it on to others. You can see the link is here and the QR code as well. And if you would like to see the options proposed for the other townships, you're welcome to check out our webpage, which offers additional information on how we're exploring solutions covering each of the township. As I also noted, there are also a series of engagement sessions planned over the next few weeks regarding all three of the plans currently being reviewed. And we're trying to do something in each of the townships as well as in the urban areas for that, to just capture as many people as possible. And as noted on the slide, as a staff contact for other questions or comments, please contact Adam Fraser, who wasn't able to join us tonight, but is the project manager with GRT for the township transit strategy. I'll leave it open in case Dennis has any other comments, or Jacob, if there's any other questions that people have, to either raise their hands or post them in the chat.
Well, I'll just echo that we really appreciate you taking the time to be here tonight and talk about transit within the township. It's an important discussion. So once again, we're here for a little bit longer. If there are any other questions or things that you want to discuss, and we're open to having that conversation.
You're welcome.
That's all the questions we got. Thank you everyone for coming.